So what is in the SPP? Well, I'd like to now give you 10 of the reasons why the NDP is fighting the SPP and why we're doing public meetings like this one across the country. This is the 23rd city we've come to. We have another dozen cities planned so far, and these are all grassroots organized events where in many cases we have standing room only crowds. Basically, people telling their family, friends, and neighbors that the SPP is something they should be concerned about and that they should learn more about. Now, it's important to note this SPP agenda isn't something that is written down on paper, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. So here are the 10 reasons why the NDP is opposing the Security and Prosperity Partnership, this SPP agenda. Reason number 1, it is anti-democratic by design. Now, we had hearings last spring on the SPP in Parliament, the International Trade Committee. I'll come back to that a few minutes later on. But at those hearings, the people who kicked it off was the organization known as the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. It's an umbrella organization that basically groups within it 150 of the largest corporations in Canada. Their chief executives provide recommendations on economic policy, and they are very much the motor, the intellectual motor behind the SPP. When the Canadian Council of Chief Executives testified in front of the International Trade Committee, they said something that was chillingly honest. They said the reason why the SPP is taking place behind closed doors without any sort of democratic oversight is because, quote, Canadians were not ready for the agenda, close quote. So this SPP agenda is taking place behind closed doors with no democratic oversight because we're not ready for what is in the agenda. Now, when you think about it, there's a kind of diabolical logic to this. Back to 1988, we had an election on the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. Most Canadians voted against that agenda put forward by Brian Mulroney, either voting for the Liberals or for the NDP. But because of the vagaries of our electoral system, the Conservatives got in, they implemented the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. The Canadians, when they had a democratic choice, voted against it. Fast forward now to 1993, we had another election on the North American Free Trade Agreement, on NAFTA. And most Canadians voted either for the NDP or for the Liberals under Jean Chrétien, who promised not to implement NAFTA. Now, you'll recall, as so often the case for the Liberals, as soon as they got in power, they reneged on that promise. But there again, democratically, most Canadians voted against that agenda. So the Canadian Council of Chief Executives is simply stating the obvious truth. If most Canadians would reject the agenda, if it was put forward to them democratically, then you should keep the agenda away from any sort of democratic oversight. So reason number 1, it is anti-democratic by design. Reason number 2, it is profoundly secret. The NDP, since the very beginning, has been filing access to information requests after access to information requests to get to the heart of the documents that form the agenda around the SPP. There are 19 working groups working away in secret. We've been trying to expose that agenda by working through the access to information process. We filed complaints with the Information Commissioner, and we've been stonewalled repeatedly by the government. But we've had hundreds of pages released after all that effort. And I'll share a couple of those pages with you in a moment. Hundreds of pages released that the government has provided to give us some sense of what is in the SPP agenda. Now, you can see 2 of these pages. Essentially, they're blanked out, particularly when we get to issues around energy and around water. They are strongly blanked out. But this is an agenda that is taking place in profound secrecy and away from the kind of oversight that even the Access to Information Act and the Information Commissioner are supposed to be protecting the public from. Reason number 3. It is about much, much more than jelly beans. You may recall Stephen Harper at the Montebello Summit last August said, Canadians don't have to worry about the SPP agenda because it's just about harmonizing jelly bean regulations. You don't have to worry, folks. It's about harmonizing candy in Canada. But the government's own documents, when they're not heavily censored, actually indicate a deep and wide-ranging agenda. covering more than 300 areas. In fact, I was in a briefing with a bureaucrat on Tuesday in Ottawa, one of the high-ranking bureaucrats that actually helped to move this agenda along. And they said, well, it's between 300 and 400 areas, but they don't really know the exact number. It's a deep and wide-ranging agenda. It is about much more than jelly beans. Reason number 4. It is about quality of life issues. Transportation safety, food safety, drug safety. These are all the requirements of a responsive democratic system. We choose to have higher level of standards because as Canadians, we want to protect our families. Well, the SPP process is about dumbing down those standards, those safety standards that we set as a society. In transportation safety, it is about reducing our standards to lower American ones. In food safety, as the Ottawa Citizen reported last spring, is actually about allowing a greater level of pesticide residue. That somebody phoning in? That may be the Prime Minister's office. Who knows? Accepting, as the Ottawa Citizen reported, a higher level of pesticide residue in Canadian food. Now, there are 2 reasons why this is a bad idea. First off, of course, it's the fact as consumers, we want to protect our families from consuming more pesticides. We know that consumption of pesticides is linked to such diseases as Parkinson's disease. It makes no sense from a consumer point of view to accept a greater level of pesticides in Canadian food. The second reason, though, is equally valid. We've had Canadian producers looking at a higher level, essentially producing to a higher level of food safety standard, and they are now going to be competing directly against products that allow more pesticides in those food. It makes no sense from a consumer point of view. It makes no sense from a producer point of view. On drug safety, just last week, Stephen Harper announced a new fast tracking of drug safety approval mechanisms. Essentially, what that would mean is that drugs such as Vioxx would be approved more rapidly in Canada. If they've gone through the American process, then they would be accepted in Canada in what they call a progressive licensing process. Well, in the United States, this is a matter of great controversy. Vioxx was rapidly approved on the American market. As a result of that, thousands of Americans died of heart attacks. Now, we cannot have in Canada a lower acceptable standard of safety when it comes to the drugs that are so important for Canadian health. So it is about quality of life issues. Reason number 5. It's about civil rights and the erosion of civil rights that we have seen. In the United States, they had a no-fly list that was implemented. It captured a number of innocent people in addition to the racial profiling that occurred. With the no-fly list, we had such individuals as Senator Ted Kennedy, who was found on the no-fly list in the United States. Pat Martin, a Winnipeg NDP MP, who was found on the list. Alistair Butt, who is a 15-year-old teenager and was told by the airline company that he should change his name because it was so difficult to get your name off the list once you were on the list. Now, the Liberals moved to implement a similar no-fly list here in Canada, and now the Conservatives have done the same. It is a slippery slope on civil rights. Another example, the Military Commissions Act. This is described by the American Civil Liberties Union as allowing detainees to be sentenced to death based on testimony obtained through beatings, and gives a get-out-of-jail-free card to the Bush administration for war crimes. That's how the American Civil Liberties Union described the War Commissions Act. How did Stephen Harper describe that same legislation? He called it, quote, appropriate judicial process, unquote.